Before winter ended, every farm below Alderwick would depend on whether a dispossessed widow could explain why a ruined water wheel turned against the river. Eliza Fenwick did not know that when her brother-in-law forced her from her home using a debt no one else had witnessed. All she knew was that her inheritance was a flooded mill with broken rafters, unpaid taxes, and 30 days before auction. The villagers called it a grave made of stone and timber. Eliza saw damaged machinery and one impossible motion. With the sluice closed and the current running east, the wheel dragged itself west, as though some buried mechanism were still obeying instructions given years ago. Saving the mill could restore her name. Failing might cost far more than the only shelter she had left. 6 weeks earlier, James Fenwick had died beneath a fallen sack hoist at the family flour mill in Leeds. By the time Eliza finished sitting beside his coffin, Ambrose Fenwick had already changed the office locks. He was James's elder brother and surviving business partner, a broad, careful man who could make cruelty sound like bookkeeping. At the probate meeting, he laid a promissory note before the solicitor and said James had borrowed £300 against his share of the business. The note bore James's signature and the mark of Ambrose's clerk, but no bank had recorded the loan, and Eliza had never heard of it. Ambrose called her grief an understandable source of confusion. The partnership agreement gave him the profitable mill. The alleged debt consumed James's cash and household goods. What remained under James's separate will was Alderwick Mill, a property bought cheaply 2 years before and never restored. "A roofless shell," Ambrose said as the solicitor pushed the deed toward her. "Take £5 for it and spare yourself the journey." Eliza looked at the date on the note, then at the smug black curve of his mourning band. Her father, Thomas Reed, had taught her to read iron wear, shaft alignment, and a man's patience with equal care. At 12, she had held a lamp while he set millstones. At 20, she could calculate the teeth required for a new gear, though customers still asked when the real mechanic would arrive. James had respected that knowledge. Ambrose had treated her tools as an embarrassment. "If the place is worthless," she said, folding the deed, "you will not miss it." The following morning he had her tool chest carried into the wet street. Her clothes, James's letters, her father's brass calipers, and 9 shillings in housekeeping money followed. Ambrose kept James's silver watch as an asset of the disputed estate. He stood beneath the doorway while Rain spotted the note in his hand and told the mill workers he was protecting a widow from liabilities she could not understand. Eliza spent 2 of her 9 shillings on a third-class railway fare north and another 6pence on a carrier's cart from Ledham Station. The driver left her at the bridge above Alderwick as daylight thinned. Below lay a long stone mill with half its slate roof open to the sky. Alder roots lifted the cobbled yard, water covered the lower windows and reflected the broken rafters in black bars. A faded parish notice nailed to the door warned that £18 7 shillings in rates remained unpaid. Unless £6 were deposited within 30 days, the property would be sold. She could have returned to the station before dark. Instead, Eliza set down her chest, took out her father's calipers, and walked to the wheel pit. The River Aster ran east beneath the bridge, swollen by 3 days of rain. The mill's sluice gate was chained shut. No water should have entered the headrace, and the oak paddles rising from the pit were furred with moss. Yet one paddle shuddered. The wheel groaned, lifted against the current, and moved 3 teeth toward the west. Eliza knelt so quickly that cold water soaked the hem of her dress. The upstream faces of the iron gear teeth were polished beneath the rust, while the downstream faces remained rough. This wheel had not merely slipped backward, it had worked backward, often enough to wear the metal smooth. From somewhere below the flooded floor came a measured knock. 3 strokes, a pause, then 1. Eliza held her breath. The wheel stopped, but the deeper rhythm continued inside the foundation. She slept that night in the driest corner of the grain loft, with her coat beneath her head and her tool chest against the door. Rain came through the roof, in 5 places. Rats moved in the husks along the wall, and twice she woke to the knock below. 3 strokes, a pause, then 1. By dawn the water had fallen 2 inches. The wheel stood motionless, as ordinary as a corpse. Eliza began with a survey, because guessing was how damaged machinery killed people. She drew the mill on the backs of Ambrose's eviction notices. The main building ran north to south. The river and tail race ran east. The head race entered from the west, but its bed was dry behind the chained sluice. According to every mill she had known, water should have driven the wheel eastward. On the great gear's inner rim, she found 13 holes drilled at equal intervals. They had no purpose in ordinary milling. A brass collar around the axle bore the worn initials MB, and beneath them a mark like 3 joined drops. At mid-morning, a boy appeared at the open doorway, carrying a coil of stripped copper wire. He was perhaps 15, narrow-faced, and ready to run. "If that came from this mill," Eliza said, "put it down. No one owns drowned things." She held up the deed. "Now someone does." The boy studied her sodden boots and the roof beyond her shoulder. "Then someone has bought a great deal of water. His name was Ben Coates. His mother kept the village alehouse, and he had been scavenging the ruin for nails and metal since his father died." Eliza offered him a penny to show her the property boundaries. Suspicion yielded to commerce. He led her along the mill pond, through waist-high nettles, and across a meadow where stone posts leaned at odd angles. Each post carried the same 3-drop mark as the axle collar. At the eastern boundary, they met Nora Tyndall, a tenant farmer in a mud-dark skirt, driving 2 cows from a waterlogged field. She looked at Eliza's deed without warmth. "That mill drowned my grandfather's brother," Nora said. "Best let the parish pull it down. Did its wheel always turn backward?" Nora's expression changed, though only for a moment. Old people had a saying, "When bell turns west, the aster rests." Nonsense used to quiet children in flood weather. Bell. Eliza thought of the initials on the collar. Who was Bell? "Dead before my mother was born." Nora flicked the reins. "The river is not." Back at the mill, a parish officer named Mr. Prowse waited beside the rates notice. His boots were clean enough to show he had come only as far as the yard. He informed Eliza that the sale order was lawful, the first deposit could not be postponed, and Ambrose Fenwick had already written offering to clear the site at his own expense if the parish obtained possession. "He wrote before I arrived?" Eliza asked. Prowse avoided her eyes. "Your family dispute is not parish business." After he left, Eliza examined the great gear again. One of the 13 drilled holes contained a splinter of black oak, squared rather than broken. She fitted a narrow punch into the hole and pressed. A hidden spring resisted, then released with a dull sound below the floor. Water trembled around a line of submerged flagstones that should have rested on solid earth. She fetched a measuring rod and probed the seam. Beneath 6 inches of silt, the rod dropped into moving water. The flow ran west, under the mill and against the river. Eliza marked the place with chalk, then forced herself to leave it alone. Curiosity would not keep rain from her blankets. She spent the next 4 days making one room fit for winter. Ben carried broken slate from the yard while she sorted what could be reused. A retired carpenter named Caleb Morrow came to warn her that the southern rafters would fail under snow. He stayed when he saw her brace the sound timbers before touching the rotten ones. "Your angle is short," he said. "By 1/2 inch," Eliza replied, "because the wall leans by 3. Caleb measured it himself, grunted, and returned the next morning with 2 lengths of seasoned larch. His price was not money. A winnowing machine in his brother's barn had been idle since its crankshaft bent, and he wanted it repaired before the oat harvest was sold. Eliza straightened the shaft over the mill's small forge, replaced a missing bearing with lignum vitae cut from an old pulley block, and earned enough timber to patch the loft roof. Word traveled reluctantly. A dairyman brought a seized cream separator. Nora Tyndall sent a broken gate hinge, but delivered it through Ben, as though direct business might imply friendship. Eliza repaired each item at a bench set beneath the one intact window. The coins were small, 4p, 6p, once a full shilling, but by the second week she had paid Ben 3 shillings, bought lamp oil, and put aside £1.11 toward the rates. The villagers still called Alderwick a grave. Eliza made it answer like a workshop. In the afternoons, she investigated the backward flow. With a spirit level balanced on a straight oak board, she measured the drowned meadow in intervals of 20 yards. The old field drains did not descend toward the river as she expected. They sloped toward the mill, too gently for the eye to detect. Their mouths had been disguised among the foundation stones and marked with the 3 joined drops. Someone had designed the entire lower valley to send water to Alderwick. That should have made flooding worse. Unless the mill had once lifted the water somewhere else. Eliza cleared silt from the flagged seam with a grain scoop. Beneath it lay an iron inspection cover, its ring hidden by corrosion. When she pulled, the ring snapped and cut her palm. Ben tore a strip from his shirt before she could object. "My mother says you will lose the hand and then the mill," he said as he wrapped it. "Your mother has a cheerful view of enterprise. She also sent stew." That evening, Miriam Coates arrived with the pot herself. She was a square-shouldered widow, with the same wary eyes as her son. She inspected the patched roof, Ben's paid account written neatly in Eliza's notebook, and the bandage on Eliza's hand. "He is not to go below the floor," Miriam said. "Neither am I, until I know what holds it up." Miriam placed the stew on the bench. "Then we understand each other." The first snow came thinly on November 13th. At dusk, the river rose over the lowest marker on the bridge. The wheel moved backward again, not 3 teeth this time, but half a turn. Each of the 13 holes passed a fixed iron pin in the masonry. At every passage, the pin entered a hole, withdrew, and transmitted a stroke through the axle. 3 strokes, a pause, then 1. The rhythm below was not an echo. It was a mechanism trying to work. Eliza disengaged the rotten millstone gears so they could not seize. She oiled the axle with the last of her good machine oil, released the brake 1 notch, and watched the wheel gather strength. Water bulged upward through the flagged seam. For a moment she feared she had opened a spring beneath the building. Then the level across the grain floor fell by the width of her smallest finger. The mechanism was drawing water down. By morning, the floor had emerged in patches, revealing pale lines scored into the stone. They formed a plan, 2 long channels from the meadow converging beneath the wheel pit, then a third line climbing toward an abandoned hillside reservoir east of the mill. At the center, someone had cut the initials MB beside the date 1812. Caleb crouched over the marks and crossed himself before pretending he had only scratched his chin. No pump raises half a valley without steam. This one may use the river twice, Eliza said. Once in its ordinary direction to grind, once in reverse when the water is high. Then why build the wheel to go backward instead of adding another? Because a second wheel would tell everyone what it was doing. She did not yet know why secrecy had mattered. She knew only that the polished gear faces, the sloping drains, and the drilled holes belonged to one design. On the 17th day, Ambrose came in a hired carriage. His black coat was too fine for the muddy yard, and he carried the silver watch that had belonged to James. Eliza felt the loss of it as sharply as if he had brought her husband's empty chair. "You have made your point," he said. "Prowse tells me you have paid nothing substantial. I will give you £10 and settle the rates. Last month it was 5. Last month I believed the structure beyond salvage." His gaze passed over the braced roof and stopped at the drying floor. "You have mistaken temporary improvement for value." Eliza noticed mud on his boots, the color of blue clay. There was no blue clay in the yard, but she had found it packed beneath the submerged cover. He or someone working for him had already been near the hidden channel. "Why did James buy Alderwick?" she asked. Ambrose thumbed the watch chain. "My brother collected hopeless causes. He never mentioned it to me. Perhaps he understood that machinery was not a proper subject for his wife." Eliza had learned that men often revealed fear by reaching for contempt. £12, she said. His eyes sharpened. "That is what you will pay me for the tools and household goods you took. The mill is not for sale." Ambrose left without answering. The next morning, 3 customers failed to collect repaired equipment. A notice appeared at the alehouse claiming Eliza had worsened the village drainage by disturbing the condemned works. Prowse gave her 7 days to close the flooded lower floor or face an immediate safety order. Instead of arguing in the street, Eliza went to the parish church. The rector, Reverend Pell, was reluctant to open the old chest until she showed him the deed and the matching marks copied from the boundary stones. Together, they searched enclosure maps, tithe schedules, and vestry minutes stiff with dust. An 1813 map showed Alderwick Mill beside a narrow blue line that divided above the wheel and rejoined the Aster downstream. The ordinary headrace was labelled Cornleet. The second line was labelled Bell's Engine. 12 small arrows led from surrounding farms toward it. In a vestry account from 1829, Eliza found payments of oats, labour and stone for the maintenance of Bell's Water. The entries ended abruptly in 1858, the year Alderwick had been abandoned. One final note directed the reader to a covenant enrolled at the North Riding Quarter Sessions, but no copy remained in the parish chest. Reverend Pell rubbed the page with one finger. "County records may have it. North Allerton is a day's travel if the roads hold." Eliza had 14 days before the sale and less than £2 in her rate's purse. A journey would cost money she did not have. She copied every line and returned to the mill, where Ben waited beside the iron cover. He had cleaned the broken ring and found a shallow depression beneath it, shaped like one of the axle pins. Eliza cut a temporary key from oak, engaged it, and asked Caleb to hold the wheel brake. As the river rose, the wheel reversed. The 13th hole met the fixed pin. The key twisted beneath Eliza's hands, and the iron cover lifted a 1/4 inch on an old screw thread. Air breathed out of the darkness below, cold and metallic. Far beneath the floor, a connecting rod moved through black water with the steady patience of something that had waited 18 years to be seen. The opening was too narrow for safe descent, and the chamber beneath remained nearly full. Eliza rigged the mill's surviving hand pump to a leather hose, while Caleb built a tripod over the hatch. For 3 days, they took turns at the handle. Ben carried the discharged water through a trench to the tail race. It was slow, blistering work. Every hour lowered the chamber by less than an inch, and seepage stole half of that back. On the second night, Eliza found Ben asleep against the pump handle. She covered him with a grain sack and finished his turn. On the 3rd morning, Miriam arrived with 6 men from the village. The dairyman, whose separator Eliza had repaired, brought a second pump. Nora Tyndall brought 2 farm labourers and announced that she had come only because standing water bred fever. No one mentioned the unpaid repairs or Ambrose's notice at the alehouse. By afternoon, the water had fallen below a stone ledge. Eliza tied a rope around her waist, lit a shielded lamp, and descended an iron ladder built into the masonry. The chamber was longer than the grain floor above. 2 great wooden pump beams lay side by side, their ends connected to vertical rods descending into stone-lined wells. Bronze flap valves, green with age, controlled the flow. A differential gear linked the beams to the waterwheel axle, and a weighted lever could choose between ordinary milling and reverse pumping. It was not magic, and it did not defy the river. A concealed upper culvert carried stored water from the hillside reservoir westward through a steep fall beneath the visible wheel pit. When the Aster rose high enough, a float gate released that water against the ordinary mill flow. The reversing wheel drove the pumps, which lifted drainage water from the fields into a raised spill channel that rejoined the Aster below the valley narrows. The designer had made one wheel do two kinds of work. Eliza touched a bearing housing and felt grit beneath her fingers. 18 years of silt had jammed the first pump. The second had continued to move because she had cleared the inspection cover, but its oak bearing was split along the grain. If the mechanism ran hard, the connecting rod would break and tear through the chamber. Above the recorded flood line, an iron cylinder was bolted to the wall. The 3-drop mark was stamped into its cap. Inside, protected by waxed linen and tinned copper, lay folded drawings, letters, and a small brass model of the reversing gear. The papers were dry at the center, though their edges had browned. They bore the name Margaret Bell. Her drawings were dated from 1809 to 1813. They showed each field drain, valve, gear, and relief channel in a hand both precise and impatient. Corrections crowded the margins. On one sheet she had calculated how many acres could be cleared after 6 hours of pumping. On another, she warned that the west control vane must never be cut free during high water because the uncontrolled fall would overspeed the wheel. The letters gave only pieces of her story. Margaret had built models in her father's smithy after the flood of 1808 drowned 3 farms. A London patent agent had refused to correspond with an unmarried woman and addressed every reply to her brother, William. Parish accounts later credited Bell and Son with the engine, though William's own letter admitted that the calculations were hers. Another page referred to a covenant protecting the system and the keeper of Alderwick Mill. The following sheet, the one that named its witnesses and obligations, was missing. "This proves who designed it," Reverend Pell said when Eliza carried the papers upstairs. "It does not prove what rights attach to your deed." The county copy might, if it survived. Eliza wrapped the papers again and placed them in her locked tool chest. She kept the model on the bench because its removable gears helped her understand the damaged bearing. That was a mistake. Samuel Dace, Ambrose's thin, pale clerk, came to Alderwick the next day with a formal purchase offer for £25. He stood in the workshop while Eliza read it, his gaze moving from the drying floor to the brass model. "Mr. Fenwick is being generous," he said. "The sale will proceed in 9 days. "Did you see James sign the note?" Eliza asked. Samuel's mouth tightened. "My mark says I did." "That was not my question." He looked toward the river. "Take the offer, Mrs. Fenwick." After he left, Eliza put the model in the chest with the papers. She also wrote to the North Riding clerk of the peace, enclosing her copied reference and fourpence for the search. Reverend Pell carried the letter to the railway post. The weather turned colder. Frost hardened the yard at night, but rain still fell on the hills. Nora reported that water stood between the winter wheat rows on the lower farms. Eliza inspected the river gauge and compared it with Margaret's drawings. The hidden float gate should open at 7 feet. At 6 feet 10, the reverse leat was already leaking. The cracked bearing might survive a short test, but not the 6-hour run required to drain the valley. Caleb found a block of seasoned elm large enough to replace it. Shaping and fitting it would take 5 days. The timber cost £1.08, nearly all the money Eliza had saved for the rates. "Buy time from Prowse," Caleb advised. "Let the fields wait." Prowse refused. He had received a legal opinion from Ambrose stating that the reverse leat diverted water across land belonging to Fenwick brothers. Any operation, he said, could expose the parish to a claim. Eliza returned to the mill beneath a low yellow sky. Miriam was waiting with news that Nora's western field had begun to flood. 2 cottages stood below it, including one occupied by a family with 3 children. If the field bank failed, the water would reach their doors. The river gauge read 6 feet 11. Eliza could keep her rates money, let the parish condemn the mill, and preserve the drawings for someone richer to study. or she could spend nearly everything on a bearing for a machine she did not legally have permission to run. She gave Caleb the money. They worked through the night. Eliza cut the elm block to Margaret's dimensions, bored it by hand, then scraped the inner curve until blue chalk transferred evenly from the shaft. Caleb strengthened the pump beam with iron straps. Ben cleaned the flap valves while Miriam held the lamp and pretended not to see him below the floor. At dawn, the gauge reached 7 feet. The float gate opened with a concussion beneath the yard. Water rushed through the hidden western culvert. The wheel turned backward, slowly at first, then with enough force to shake dust from the rafters. Eliza eased the new bearing into load. The connecting rods rose and fell. Beneath the meadow, drains that had been silent for 18 years began drawing. For 2 hours the system worked. Water retreated from Nora's wheat rows and stopped below the cottage thresholds. Villagers gathered on the bridge, watching brown water surge from the pump outlet into the raised spill channel. Then the old bearing on the second beam split. Eliza heard the change before anyone else, a hard double strike where the rhythm should have been even. She reached the clutch lever, but the corroded linkage would not move. The beam jumped in its guides. If the connecting rod broke, it could shatter the axle housing. She climbed onto the vibrating frame with a hammer and drove out the wooden shear pin that coupled the damaged pump. The freed beam dropped. Its end struck the ledge and flung Eliza against the stone wall. Pain flashed through her left shoulder. Above her, the wheels slowed but continued turning on the single sound pump. Caleb pulled her up the ladder. You could have lost the arm. The shear pin was meant to break. It was meant to be reached with the machine stopped. Outside, Nora stood ankle-deep in a field that had been knee-deep at dawn. She looked at Eliza's hanging arm and then at the clear line left by the falling water. My grandfather said the mill took his brother, she said. Perhaps he never told us how many it saved. The farmers brought a cart and carried Eliza to Miriam's alehouse, where the village surgeon bound her shoulder. It was badly bruised, not broken. By evening, 3 tenants had offered to advance their winter drainage dues if a lawful association could be restored. Their support came too late for the rates deposit, but it changed the sound of the room when Prowse arrived with an order to seal the mill. Ambrose had secured an interim injunction against operating the leat. He had also purchased the outstanding rates demand from a parish creditor. Unless Eliza paid the full £6 by noon the next day, his agent would take possession pending the auction. He cannot buy my deed through a side door, Eliza said. He has bought the debt attached to it, Prowse replied, and he says your unauthorized machinery endangered his land. Eliza looked around the alehouse at the farmers whose fields were no longer drowning. Ambrose's legal paper could turn them back into spectators if she allowed it. Then he will have to say so in public, she said. Ask the magistrate for a hearing. Prowse agreed to request one, but he would not delay the sealing order. At noon, while Eliza watched from the bridge with her arm in a sling, a bailiff locked the workshop and nailed the injunction across the door. The wheels stood still. Behind the upper windows, her tool chest held Margaret Bell's papers, James's letters, and the only model of the machine Ambrose wanted buried. Ben woke Eliza before dawn by throwing gravel at Miriam's upstairs window. 2 covered carts had entered the mill yard after midnight. He had watched from the bridge as Samuel Dace opened the gate for Ambrose and 3 labourers. They carried a small chest to one cart and drove away toward Ledham. Eliza went to Alderwick with Miriam, Caleb and Prowse. The bailiff's wax seal hung broken from the workshop door. Her tool chest had been forced. Margaret's brass model, the iron document cylinder, and every original drawing were gone. Her father's calipers remained on the floor where someone had stepped on them. One leg was bent. A torn corner of Margaret's warning about the west control vane clung beneath the chest. Prowse's face lost its official calm. The order permitted no removal. Will you put that in writing? Eliza asked. He hesitated only once. I will. Ambrose denied entering the building. By noon he had produced an inventory signed by Samuel, stating that the model and papers belonged to James's unsettled estate and had been delivered voluntarily by Eliza before the mill was sealed. Samuel did not appear in the village to defend the claim. Ambrose also petitioned for permission to dismantle the wheel, arguing that its movement threatened the riverbank. The magistrate set a hearing for Monday, 4 days away. In the meantime, no one could lawfully operate or alter the works. That should have protected the mill. On Saturday morning, Nora found fresh cart ruts leading to the hillside reservoir. Eliza followed them, despite the ache in her shoulder. At the west control shaft, the protective iron cage had been pried away. The oak vane described in Margaret's warning was held by a chain and a removable stop. Someone had sawn almost through the stop, then packed the cut with blue clay to hide it. The clay matched the stains she had seen on Ambrose's boots. He had not destroyed the gate yet. He had prepared it to fail when the river rose, making the ancient mechanism appear dangerously unsound. The saw cut was too deep to brace in place. Removing the stop would violate the injunction. Leaving it would allow the next surge to tear the vein open. Snow lay on the western hills, and a warm rain had begun. Eliza sent Ben to fetch Prowse and made a scale drawing of the damaged shaft before anyone touched it. Caleb measured the saw kerf. Nora brought 2 witnesses from neighboring farms. They all signed the page. Only then did Eliza bind the stop with chain without moving the water control itself. "Will it hold?" Nora asked. "Until the pond rises another foot." The answer came that afternoon in the form of a packet from North Allerton. Reverend Pell carried it from the station beneath his coat, the paper still damp at the corners. The county clerk had found not only the 1813 covenant, but a bundle of engineering declarations filed after the flood of 1829. The covenant named every 3-drop boundary stone. It granted the keeper of Alderwick Mill a perpetual easement to collect drainage water from the lower farms, lift it into the raised spill channel, and maintain the reservoir and both channels across adjoining land. In exchange, each benefited holding owed an annual contribution of grain, labor, or money. The mill could be sold, but the drainage rights could not be separated from it or diverted exclusively to an industrial concern. Any keeper who preserved the engine acted on behalf of the whole valley. Attached to the covenant was Margaret Bell's sworn declaration. She described the reversing wheel, the 13-pin counting gear that timed each pump stroke, and the marked stones that fixed the buried drains. Her brother William acknowledged her as designer. The 1829 witnesses recorded that 6 hours of reverse pumping had kept the Aster within its banks during the worst flood in living memory. The clerk had also enclosed a copy of an inquiry James sent the previous spring. James had found a reference to Bell's Water while examining a proposal from the Redmarsh Reservoir Company. The company wanted Alderwick's hillside reservoir and water easements for a private supply line to a new bleaching works. James had refused to sell until he understood the farmers' rights. In the margin he had written that Eliza's knowledge of mill gearing would be essential if the machine survived. For the first time since his death, Eliza heard something of James unfiltered by Ambrose. He had not hidden Alderwick because he doubted her. He had been trying to bring her into its restoration. The packet did not restore the stolen drawings, pay the rates, or repair the damaged gate. It did establish that Ambrose's claim about an unlawful channel was false. More dangerously for him, the reservoir company's proposal named Ambrose as the intended agent and promised him a commission if he obtained an unencumbered title before January. "He needs the engine ruined," Caleb said, "so no one can prove the covenant still serves a purpose." The river gauge passed 7 feet at dusk. The chain around the sawn stop drew taut. Under the yard, the hidden culvert began to rumble. Prowse arrived with the village constable and read the county covenant by lantern light. He withdrew his safety order, but the injunction remained until the magistrate could review it. The law had created a trap. Touching the gate risked contempt. Doing nothing risked the valley. Nora looked toward the dark fields where water already shone between the hedges. "My signature is on your drawing. If the magistrate wants someone, he may begin with me." One by one, the other farmers added their names beneath hers, requesting emergency operation under the covenant. Prowse signed as witness. The sawn stop broke before midnight. The west vein flew open, releasing the hillside reservoir through the reverse culvert. The wheel lunged backward. With no control to limit the flow, it accelerated until the paddles blurred and the mill shook. The 13-pin gear hammered wildly. A loose roof slate shattered in the yard. Eliza understood why Margaret had drilled 13 holes instead of using a continuous crank. The counting gear did more than drive the pump. Every 13th stroke lifted a small relief latch, allowing the vein to settle before the next cycle. The missing oak splinter she had found in the first hole was the remains of a sacrificial pin. When the mill was abandoned, the pins had rotted away, leaving nothing to govern the gate. She could not replace 13 pins while the wheel moved. She could, however, slow the axle by loading the surviving pump, then use the repaired clutch to engage the second beam in short intervals. The broken bearing made that dangerous, but Caleb's remaining elm was large enough for a temporary half-shell. They worked inside a roar. Caleb shaped the wood while Eliza heated and straightened the clutch linkage. Ben and Miriam stayed above, passing tools through the hatch. Nora organized men along the field drains to clear debris. Prowse and the constable guarded the yard. At 2 in the morning, Samuel Dace appeared on foot, without coat or hat. Mud covered him to the knees. He carried Margaret's brass model beneath his shirt and the iron cylinder under one arm. "Mr. Fenwick ordered the west stop cut," he said. "When I told him the rain made it dangerous, he said the blame would fall on her." Samuel placed the stolen things at Eliza's feet. "He made me witness James's note 3 days after Mr. James died. I signed because I owed him money. Tonight, he said he would swear I forged it alone." Eliza wanted to despise him cleanly. Instead, she saw a frightened clerk who had helped take her home and had come only when the same cruelty turned toward him. "You will tell the magistrate," she said. Samuel swallowed. "Yes." "Then take that lamp and hold it steady." Using the returned model, Eliza set the temporary bearing and engaged the damaged beam. The extra load slowed the wheel. Caleb drove new oak pins into the counting gear as each empty hole came within reach. On the 13th stroke, the relief latch rose. The west vein settled by a hand's breadth. The violent shaking eased into the deep cadence Eliza had first heard beneath the flooded floor. 3 strokes, a pause, then 1. Both pumps began lifting water. Across the lower valley, the buried drains answered. The raised spill channel filled, while the Aster continued east, and between the two currents, the wheel turned west, through the remaining hours of darkness. At dawn, the rain weakened. Nora rode the lower road and returned with mud to her saddle skirts, and tears she refused to acknowledge. Water had reached the orchard walls, but not the cottages. The wheat fields lay in broad, shallow sheets, already draining toward Alderwick. No bank had failed. Eliza shut the west vein in stages, exactly as Margaret's model instructed. When the river gauge dropped below 7 feet, the float mechanism closed the reverse culvert. The wheel slowed and stopped with one new oak pin facing upward. Silence settled over the mill, followed by the small, ordinary sounds of dripping beams and exhausted people breathing. Ambrose arrived at 9, in a carriage, with his solicitor and 2 men from the reservoir company. He ordered the constable to remove Eliza for violating the injunction. Prowse met him at the gate and handed the solicitor copies of the county covenant, the farmer's emergency request, and his account of the broken seal. "Those papers are disputed," Ambrose said. "The cut gate is not," Prowse replied. Samuel stepped out of the mill carrying the saw found beside the control shaft. Ambrose's face changed. The genial concern he wore in public gave way to naked calculation, and he made the error greed had been preparing for him from the beginning. "You were paid to remove that engine before she found the county record," he said. No one in the yard moved. Then Ambrose saw the solicitor's expression and tried to call the words back. He claimed fatigue, confusion, and betrayal by a dishonest clerk. The constable took the saw, the reservoir agreement, and Samuel's written statement. Ambrose was not arrested in the yard, but he returned to Ledham under instruction to appear at Monday's hearing and not to enter Alderwick again. The hearing filled the parish assembly room. Tenant farmers stood along the walls in work coats still stained by the flood. The Reservoir Company sent a London barrister who was careful to say his employers had relied entirely upon Ambrose's assurance that the water rights were private and unencumbered. Ambrose sat at the front beside his solicitor, the silver watch visible across his waistcoat. The magistrates considered 3 questions. Did Eliza lawfully own the mill? Did the mill possess the drainage easements she had used? And had her operation of the mechanism created the danger Ambrose alleged? The probate deed answered the first. James had owned Alderwick separately from the Fenwick brothers' partnership, and his will conveyed it to Eliza. Ambrose's promissory note might affect the cash estate, but not property named as a specific bequest without a separate mortgage. The enrolled covenant answered the second. Reverend Pell identified the parish references. Nora and 3 other farmers identified the marked boundary stones on their holdings. Eliza laid Margaret Bell's drawings beside the county declaration and showed how the 3-drop marks, the 13-pin gear, and the buried drains matched details recorded 63 years earlier. The covenant remained attached to the land because no lawful release had ever been enrolled. For the third question, Eliza used the brass model. She did not ask the magistrates to trust mystery. She turned its small handle and showed how the floatgate reversed the wheel, how the counting pins governed the vane, and how a cut stop would force the mechanism beyond its designed speed. Caleb gave the measurements of the saw kerf. Prowse produced the signed drawing made before the repair. The constable showed that blue clay from the concealed cut remained in the saw teeth. Mrs. Fenwick altered a condemned machine, Ambrose's solicitor said. Can she claim certainty about the intention of a woman dead more than 40 years? Eliza opened Margaret's 1829 declaration. I claim no certainty beyond what she drew, built, marked, and proved in a flood. The fields outside provide the most recent test. The room did not cheer. It was better than cheering. The farmers began naming what the water had not taken. 6 cottages, Nora's winter wheat, the lower bridge, 40 head of cattle moved across ground that remained passable. Their testimony turned an old invention into a present obligation. Samuel then testified that Ambrose had ordered him to witness James's promissory note 3 days after the death. Ambrose accused him of forging it alone. Eliza asked permission to examine the original. The note was dated January, but its paper carried the watermark of a new Crowther mill batch that Fenwick brothers had not purchased until May. Eliza knew, because ordering office paper had been one of the invisible tasks Ambrose considered suitable for a woman. The stationer's invoice, retrieved from the business books by court order that morning, confirmed the delivery date. The magistrates lifted the injunction and referred the broken seal, cut gate, theft, and suspected forgery to the county authorities. They barred Ambrose from disposing of James's disputed assets, pending an audit. The parish withdrew the auction after the 12 farms named in the covenant paid their current drainage contributions, £9 4 shillings in all, to an account administered jointly by Prowse and the millkeeper. £6 cleared the required deposit. The remainder bought oak for proper control pins. When the order was read, Ambrose's public composure finally deserted him. He said the valley owed its safety to Fenwick money, not to an eccentric woman or a dead smith's daughter. Nora answered before Eliza could. Your money cut the gate. Their work kept it standing. Ambrose was escorted out through a passage that opened without anyone making room for him. The silver watch remained in his pocket, but for the first time, Eliza did not feel that James went with it. Legal victory did not put slate on the roof. It did not straighten the warped axle, dredge the ordinary millpond, or rebuild the western retaining wall. On Tuesday morning, Alderwick was still a cold, damaged mill with one safe room, 2 exhausted pumps, and more repairs than money. Eliza began with an account book. The Drainage Association agreed to pay £27 a year, divided among the farms according to acreage benefited. In return, Eliza would inspect the marked drains each spring and autumn, maintain the reverse mechanism, and operate it whenever the river gauge required. Milling tolls could provide a second income once one pair of stones was restored. Her repair bench already provided a third. She budgeted for the west gate first, the roof second, and the milling gear last. Caleb became foreman at 18 shillings a week during the main repairs, and less when work slowed. Ben signed an apprenticeship agreement that guaranteed wages after his first year and 3 evenings of schooling each week. Miriam insisted on that clause. Nora organized labor owed under the covenant, recording each cart of stone and day of ditch clearing so no prosperous farmer could satisfy his duty with promises while poorer tenants worked. Winter remained hard. The pumps ran twice in December and once during a January thaw. Eliza's shoulders stiffened in cold weather, and she could not lift above her head for 6 weeks. She miscalculated the cost of lime mortar, lost 10 days when a supplier sent green timber, and had to close her workshop during roof repairs. One night ice cracked a bronze valve seat and undid a fortnight's careful fitting. The village blacksmith, Amos Trigg, continued to call the association Mrs. Fenwick's underwater parish, even while accepting payment to forge its new gate straps. Help did not arrive because everyone suddenly loved her. It came because they had seen her spend her rate's money on their fields, climb into a dangerous machine, keep honest accounts, and submit her claims to evidence. Trust accumulated like the repaired mill itself, one fitted piece at a time. In February, the county audit of Fenwick Brothers was completed. James's supposed debt disappeared from the books because it had never existed. Ambrose had also charged personal payments from the reservoir company to the partnership and concealed 2 years of flour sales. The court placed the business under a receiver. Eliza recovered James's lawful share after genuine creditors were paid, along with her household goods and the silver watch. At the spring assizes, Ambrose pleaded guilty to conspiracy to defraud and malicious damage after Samuel's testimony and the paper evidence made a trial unlikely to help him. He received 18 months imprisonment with hard labor and was ordered to make restitution from his seized interest in the partnership. Samuel admitted false attestation and theft. Because he had returned the documents, warned of the sabotage, and given evidence, the court imposed a short sentence, already satisfied by the months he had spent awaiting the case. Eliza neither forgave him nor asked for greater punishment. Consequences, she had learned, were not the same as revenge. James's recovered share amounted to enough to repair Alderwick, but not to transform it overnight. Eliza kept most of the money invested while masons rebuilt the retaining wall over 10 weeks. A wheelwright replaced 6 rotten paddles and trued the axle in April. The upper roof was finished in May. Dredging the pond lasted into June and uncovered the stone intake exactly where Margaret's drawings placed it. The stolen papers returned to the iron cylinder after copies were deposited with the county archive and parish chest. At Reverend Pell's suggestion, the assembly room displayed Margaret Bell's declaration beside her brother's acknowledgement. Eliza resisted a grand memorial. Instead, Caleb fixed a small brass plate to the pump chamber, naming Margaret as designer and listing the farms protected by her engine. A name restored to useful work seemed more fitting than one carved above a locked door. By midsummer, one pair of millstones turned in the ordinary direction. Alderwick ground oats and barley 3 days a week. On the other days, Eliza repaired farm machines and taught Ben how to draw a gear before cutting it. Miriam's widowed cousin joined the accounts room, and 2 girls from the village came on Saturdays to learn measuring, filing, and safe forge work. Eliza did not call it a school. She simply refused to make knowledge invisible because of the hands that held it. Nora's wheat survived the flood, but yielded poorly after the long waterlogging. The association reduced her contribution and accepted ditch labor instead. The next season, with the drains cleared and the river managed, her lower field produced its best crop in 12 years. Amos Trigg remained skeptical, as promised by his nature, but paid his water due in full and stopped calling the mill drowned. On the anniversary of James's death, Eliza carried his watch to the bridge. She had repaired the bent minute hand and cleaned flour dust from the case, but she did not wear it. In the workshop it hung beside her father's straightened calipers, not as a measure of what Ambrose had returned, but as part of the work James had intended them to begin. The autumn rain arrived during the night. By morning, the river gauge touched 7 feet. Ben closed the ordinary mill clutch. Eliza inspected the 13 oak pins, tested the relief latch, and opened the safety brake. Farmers along the lower road lifted drain grates without waiting to be summoned. The hidden float rose. Water entered the western culvert, and the great wheel turned backward with a low, confident groan. In the pump chamber, Margaret's twin beams settled into their measured cadence. Outside, the Aster traveled east toward the sea. Beneath the fields, another current moved west toward Alderwick, carrying floodwater away from roots, doorsteps, and winter grain. Sun broke through the rain and entered the repaired upper window. It caught the ordinary flour dust suspended above Eliza's bench, while the wheel below worked in its extraordinary direction. She rested one hand on the warm axle housing and listened until every stroke came true.